And remember, lipids is just a fancy science word for the fats. And when we talked about lipids, we said that they did two very important things. The first thing was that they were good for long-term energy storage, which means energy that you don't need right away, but you'll be thankful that you saved it up for later. The other thing that lipids are very important for is cell membranes. So remember, you are entirely made of cells, and each of those cells, so there's like cell junk in here, each of those cells is encapsulated or surrounded by a membrane that is composed almost entirely of lipids. One of the other things we said was that a monomer of a lipid, the monomer, meaning like the building block, is a fatty acid. So it's going to be important that we know what a fatty acid looks like. I'm going to draw one for you here. We're going to start with our carbons. And I made them zigzag a little bit, but that's okay. And I'm going to record over on the side here the elements that we're using to make this fatty acid. So, our first element, carbon, is represented by this C. So we're good to go with carbon. What's connected to these carbons are hydrogens, which is represented on the periodic table by the letter H. And we know that carbon can make 4 bonds. So we should never have more than 4 lines coming out of one carbon. So for all of these, I'm adding 2 H's. But then at the bottom, we only have this carbon bonded to one other thing. So this carbon has an extra hydrogen. So now you can see that this carbon has 4 bonds just like the other carbons. So the other element we have here is hydrogen. Both of those were on our chart, so it's good that we're able to check them off. Because this part here is just carbons and hydrogens, we call this a hydrocarbon, just smushing the two words together, a hydrocarbon chain. You can see that H is in there to remind you, and the C. So a hydrocarbon chain is just a bunch of C's and H's put together. But when we were filling out our chart for the biological macromolecules, we mentioned another element that was also present in a lipid, and that was oxygen. So we need to incorporate the oxygen into our sketch of a fatty acid. So what happens here is that this carbon is bonded to an oxygen over here that also has a hydrogen attached to it. And then it's double bonded to another oxygen. So because we have 2 oxygens, one here and one here, we can now check off oxygen. So we've included all 3 of the elements that we needed in a lipid. And this is a fatty acid. There are 2 types of fatty acids that we're going to expect you to know. The first type is called a saturated fat. And we call it saturated because it is saturated, which just means that it's full, and it's full with hydrogens. So what we drew here was an example of a saturated fat. All of our carbons in our carbon chain, so this one, this one, this one, and this one, are all full of hydrogens. We're just going to redraw the fatty acid that we already did. Our oxygen over here, oxygen over here. This one has a hydrogen attached and is only bonded once to our carbon. This other oxygen is double bonded to our carbon. For this chain, I'm going to write 4 carbons. And I'm going to saturate it, or I'm going to fill it with hydrogens. Lots of H's. But if you've looked at a nutrition label, you don't just see saturated fat, you also see another type of fat. And that is called unsaturated fat. And these are not full with hydrogens. And I'll show you why. We're still going to draw our OH group. That's still going to be the same, connected to the carbon, which is also double bound to an oxygen. And I'm still going to draw my 4 carbons in my hydrocarbon chain. But I'm going to change one thing. So I'm going to add another bond and make this bond between carbon and carbon into a double bond. So now I'm going to be adding my hydrogens. And I have to remember that carbon can only have 4 bonds total. So for this carbon here, I can still add the 2 that I could add for the saturated fat. But let's count the bonds for the next carbon. This carbon is making 1, 2, 3 bonds already. And carbon can only make 4 bonds. So instead of having 2 hydrogens on this carbon, this one only gets 1. Same if we look at this carbon and we look at the bonds. So that carbon also only gets 1 hydrogen. And then the carbon on the bottom can still make 3 more bonds, so it gets its 3 hydrogens it expects. So an unsaturated fat has a double bonded carbon somewhere in its hydrocarbon chain, which means that instead of adding 2 hydrogens, it can only get 1 additional hydrogen.